Look at problem number 4 in your guided practice. So I have 43 multiplied by 108. So I'm going to look and I'm going to see if I can make this an overestimate or an underestimate. So first I'm going to take a look at both of these. I'm not going to start with 43. I'm actually going to start with 108 because 108, I can look at that and say, oh, that's near 100. I'm going to use that one. Now, here's the thing. Because I'm multiplying by 100, I'm really going to be multiplying by 1, right? So anything times 1 is 1. That's the identity property of multiplication. So I'm actually okay leaving this alone. So I didn't round both numbers. So this would be an example of compatible numbers. 108 is near 100 is a compatible number. 43 is 43. So I'm using compatible numbers here. So again, I multiply 43 times 1 and I get 43. And then I have to remember that because I had 2 zeros here, I need to make sure that I have 2 zeros there. So I now have 4,300. Well, here I rounded down, and here I stayed the same. So is this going to be an overestimate or an underestimate? Well, if I didn't change this number, but I rounded down on this number, it's going to be an underestimate. All right, so let's take a look at your last problem. So your last problem is going to be 380 multiplied by 690. So 380 multiplied by 690. So I don't know two-digit multiplication by two-digit multiplication. So I'm going to go ahead and I feel comfortable rounding these. And I don't know 38 multiplied by 69. So I don't want to leave these alone either. So 380 is close to 400. And 69 is close to 700. So again, I just worry about my 4 and 7, and I ignore the zeros for now. So I'm using that multiple 10 rule. I can add and take away zeros as I want in my factors as long as I do the same thing on this side to keep that equation balanced. Okay, so I have 4 multiplied by 7, which is going to be 28. And then I have 4 zeros, so I need to do 1, 2, 3, 4. So my answer is going to be 280,000. Overestimate or underestimate? Well, I rounded up here and I rounded up here, so it's going to be an overestimate. So at this point, if you are feeling comfortable with how to estimate, you may go ahead and stop the video and start working on your independent practice. But I'm going to do a few more problems just so we can see whether or not we're going to use compatible numbers or rounding and get a little bit more familiar with that multiple of 10 rule. So my first value that I'm going to have is I'm going to take a look at 87 multiplied by 403. So I'm actually going to take 403 and I'm going to round that to 400. Okay, so I rounded down. And then I'm going to take 87 and I'm going to round that to 90. So I rounded up on that one. So I have 90 multiplied by 400. Multiple of 10 rule says I can add and take away zeros as much as I want to on my factors, as long as I add the same number of zeros on this side. So I'm going to take away, ignore my zeros. So I have 1, 2, 3 that I'll have to put on the end over here in order to keep that equation nice and balanced. So I have 9 times 4, which is going to be 36. And then again, I have 1, 2, 3. So my answer should have 1, 2, 3. So my answer is going to be 36,000. Okay. I talked about in the first video that sometimes you're going to have an answer that is going to give you a factor that ends in a 0. So let's take a look at one of those factors that's going to end in 0. So if I have 415 and I multiply that by 47. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use rounding. 415, I'm going to round that down to 400. And then 47, I'm going to round up to 50. Now, I'm going to multiply 5 times 4, and I get 20. Now, this 0, I can't include as part of my original count. So I have to add 1, 2, 3 zeros. So it's 1, 2, 3 zeros for an estimate of 20,000. Because my product of 4 times 5 is 20, I have to make sure that I have that extra 0. Okay? And then let's look at if this is going to be an overestimate or an underestimate, because I rounded down here, but I rounded up here. So 415, I rounded down by 15. And here I rounded up by 3. So because my value that I rounded down is greater than the value that I rounded up, this is going to be an underestimate. Okay, so that's a good example of when to determine if it's an overestimate and underestimate. Look at how much you change the value, and whichever side has the greater number, that's whether it's going to be an overestimate or underestimate. So because I rounded down more than I rounded up, it's an underestimate. Let's take a look at another example. So if I have 189, and I'm going to multiply that by 32. Okay, so 189 multiplied by 32. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to round this up to 200. And then I'm going to round 32 down to 30. And I end up with 6, and then I count my zeros, 1, 2, 3. So I end up with 6,000. So now that I have 6,000, I need to determine whether it's an overestimate or an underestimate. Well, here I rounded down, and here I rounded up. So this situation is opposite of what we just saw in the last problem. So now I have to look at by how much I rounded up versus how much I rounded down. So I rounded down by 2, but I rounded up by 11. So the amount I rounded up is greater than the amount I rounded down. So this is going to be an overestimate. Just wanted to give you guys another example of how to determine that looks different than the problem we just had, but because the value here was greater than the value here, it's an overestimate. The last problem, it was an underestimate because the amount I rounded down by was greater than the amount I rounded up by. Okay? So I hope that you understand how to estimate products by using rounding and compatible numbers. Rounding is probably going to be the one that you use more than your compatible numbers, but you need to be aware of when you can round by a compatible number to help get you a more exact answer. So at this time, I'd like for you guys to go ahead and work on your independent practice. And then when you finish your independent practice, you need to go ahead and do the backside, the math problems, math practices, and problem solving.